Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Bertha Snilstveit. I'm the Director of Synthesis and Reviews at 3IE, and I'm joined by Esteban Quinones, who's a Senior Evaluation Specialist at 3IE. We're delighted to be sharing some of our work with you today as part of the State of the Evidence on Climate Action series at COP. So at 3IE, we have been chipping away at developing and advocating for evidence-informed climate action for close to 2 decades. So when Kevin and colleagues from Deval asked us to take part in this event and share findings from our research, we got really excited. For this 30-minute slot, we want to use the opportunity to share some highlights of our work in the climate space. Esteban will be presenting for around 15 minutes, and then we have around 10 minutes for questions. We don't have much time today, and this is an important agenda for us. So we view this as an opportunity to continue dialogue with existing partners and hopefully also as a chance to connect with new partners with a shared agenda for more and better climate action. Before handing over to Esteban, I want to highlight 3 key takeaways from our work to date. So starting with a positive highlight. So we are seeing through our work that there is existing evidence available that can and should be used to inform policy and program decisions. Whilst climate is both complex and context specific, our work shows that it's both possible and important to apply robust causal inference methodologies to evaluate climate interventions. Secondly, overall, the evidence suggests a need to be bolder and more innovative and evidence-driven in policy and programming if we are to achieve the scale of impact that is needed to mitigate and adapt to climate change in a way that minimizes human suffering and destruction of nature. Finally, the evidence that is available pales in comparison with the scale of investment going into climate change mitigation and adaptation action. In many ways, in many areas, we are flying blind without robust evidence underpinning action. The cost of failure is high and potentially catastrophic. So investing in evidence-informed climate action provides a cheap insurance against such a failure. So these are some of the key takeaways that we want to get across. And Esteban will talk us through some of the examples that underpin this. Over to you, Esteban.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thrilled to be here. So we can move to the next slide. Today, I'm going to be discussing the state of evidence on climate action, and it's through a lens of 4 to 5 key areas that 3IE has focused on. The first is risk mitigation and management. The second is the energy transition. The third are nature-based solutions with a dual emphasis on livelihoods and land management. The fourth is on climate resilience. And then innovative methods for generating evidence where traditional approaches face constraints is an underlying or cross-cutting theme that will also surface, though we won't focus on that as much today owing to the lack of time. I'd like to start by sharing a little bit more about 3IE with you. So 3IE is an evidence partner that produces and disseminates research to meet evidence needs and to facilitate evidence-informed decision-making. Rigorous causal evidence is our guiding light, and we seek to answer questions to pressing development challenges. To date, we've supported more than 300 impact evaluations and over 60 synthesis studies covering more than 50 countries on topics that span the full range of development sectors. There are a few things about our approach that I would like to highlight. The first are evidence gap maps. These are a 3IE invention that displays research clusters and gaps in accessible, intuitive, and visual formats. The second are systematic reviews and evidence synthesis. We use these and gold method standards to evaluate a body of evidence and answer critical policy questions about interventions, their effectiveness, their cost efficiency, equity, and why they do or don't work. We also conduct impact evaluations using experimental, quasi-experimental, and theory-based methods. And we do that to understand whether a program was effective or not, and how those results came to be. We generate evidence to facilitate knowledge translation, evidence use, and to inform real-world decisions. In so doing, we collaborate with partners all over the world, sharing our research methods and making our research available publicly to strengthen global capacity for evidence production, learning, and impact. So with that in mind, we're going to get right into the meat of the topics and the research and the evidence. So the first evidence area that we're going to focus on today is managing climate impact and risk. So the Agricultural Insurance Evidence Window represents one of 3IE's flagship testing to impact measurement evidence programs. It began with a formative evaluation phase covering 14 promising interventions that were designed to increase uptake for insurance, establish demand, and facilitate implementation viability. From this cohort of interventions and studies, there were 6 studies focused on loan bundling products, agricultural technology solutions for lowering barriers to insuring farmers, and marketing and product awareness focused interventions were selected for rigorous impact evaluation. We found that in spite of its critical role for shifting risk from vulnerable smallholders, agriculture insurance is a challenging intervention. It's often hampered by supply side, demand side, and delivery issues. Its greatest value is in microloan embedded forms, facilitating access to finance for farmers for agricultural production while de-risking loans from the financial sector, or for the financial sector. Insurance embedded loans give farmers the ability to increase agricultural expenditures and make investment decisions with greater autonomy. Tech-based platforms such as picture-based insurance help address barriers to delivery, including costliness of claim verification. However, we have to note that we did not find impacts on well-being. In spite of the uptake focus, farmers were often unaware of their insurance status and the features of their product as well. Next, we'll move into the energy transition area. So 3IE partnered with Sustainable Energy for All to conduct a systematic review and evidence gap map examining off-grid electrification interventions, solar technologies, improved cook stoves, and energy access programs in low and middle-income countries. We identified 668 impact evaluations relevant to this space. Off-grid technologies' primary value is in providing energy access to unserved rural populations and reducing reliance on traditional fuels like kerosene, thereby addressing both energy poverty and climate goals simultaneously. However, implementation remains challenging. Financial barriers for end users, technical capacity gap among providers, and significant geographic evidence gap are pervasive across the entire sector. Programs should carefully consider local context and implementation mechanisms. Key design choices, such as subsidies versus free provision, or individual ownership versus community ownership models, significantly affect uptake and sustainability. Finally, on this point, There is much more research that is needed on direct climate outcomes, such as emission reductions and air quality improvements associated with off-grid electrification, rather than strictly a focus on energy access metrics. Evidence is also particularly scarce in countries with the lowest electrification rates, where these interventions are most needed. Next, we're going to move into protecting livelihoods and land resources. So the focus here is on livelihoods and land use management, particularly forested land, which are pivotal pieces to addressing climate and biodiversity crises via nature-based solutions. It should, however, be noted that land conservation objectives often do come into tension with agriculture, which is the largest driver of deforestation. Our systematic review of land management intervention covered community-based or decentralized land management and monitoring, land rights, and protected areas. Examining 64 impact evaluations, we found that these interventions are a viable strategy for sustainable use of land resources and livelihood generation. Our takeaway is that there are several programmatic and policy implications that must be considered for well-designed programs. First, environmental and human well-being outcomes are closely linked. Interventions overlooking their dynamic interactions and mechanisms can result in significant trade-offs. Alignment with local livelihoods supports sustainability and creates virtuous land livelihood cycles. Knowledge sharing and collaboration enable success, but conservation goals may unintentionally harm livelihoods or ecosystems if incentives are misaligned. Our related climate change and biodiversity evidence gap map that we'll cover in this next slide included 64 interventions across 4 natural systems and production activities: land and forests, agriculture and livestock, aquaculture and fisheries, as well as coasts and oceans. We found 1,512 impact evaluations and 93 systematic reviews that were relevant. In spite of this, the evidence base is disparate, with insufficient bodies of evidence to understand which are particularly more or less effective. Aside from land and forest interventions, which I just discussed, some agriculture and livestock interventions were found to be effective, such as citizen engagement-focused interventions on irrigation infrastructure, and also certification product interventions on producer prices and ag income from certified products. However, findings are quite mixed, as the interventions were sometimes also associated with lower yields. There is a high representation of evidence in this area from China, Ethiopia, Brazil, India, and Indonesia, but fewer rigorous studies exist in many countries that are particularly exposed or vulnerable to climate change. This dearth of evidence is concerning given the rate and the breadth of biodiversity loss and severity of those consequences. Next, we're going to move into strengthening resilience. So 3IE's resilience evidence gap map mapped 362 impact evaluations and systematic reviews that covered a wide range of topics, including disaster risk financing management, early warning systems, natural resources and environmental management, social cohesion, conflict resolution, among many others. Unsurprisingly, though, the portfolio programs are very common intervention approaches, and this is usually done because of the multidimensional nature of resilience outcomes. However, the relative effectiveness of standalone versus combined interventions is unknown. It's therefore quite unclear whether resources are being expended efficiently on combined programs or whether outcomes could be achieved with fewer or standalone approaches. The evidence base does, however, indicate that climate-smart agriculture technologies, such as climate-resilient crops, do increase food security. Additionally, focused psychosocial support interventions are effective for reducing PTSD and functional impairment, increasing hope, coping, and social support. And within fragile and conflict-affected areas, women's empowerment programs, such as asset and cash transfers, improve economic outcomes. Self-help groups and village savings and loans associations facilitate capacity and access of financial systems, decent work, and freedom of movement. Finally, technical and vocational education and training do improve multiple dimensions of empowerment, like access, capacity, and political representation. Next, we're going to move into climate resilience with an emphasis on agriculture systems. As many of us here know, climate change threatens agricultural systems and rural livelihoods across low and middle income countries via multiple pathways. Direct impacts on food production, resource depletion, and limited adaptive capacity are among those that stand out. Building resilience requires interventions across the full spectrum, from infrastructure to practices and through diversification. 3IE's Geospatial Impact Evaluation Program examined 4 climate resilience agriculture interventions: irrigation infrastructure in Niger, sustainable wetland cultivation in Sierra Leone and Guinea, water management practices in Bangladesh, and integrated agriculture systems in Malawi. We found that these interventions can improve food production and balance conservation with livelihoods, but effectiveness varies widely by implementation context. In Niger, irrigation infrastructure showed an 8-fold difference in vegetation outcomes across sites, highlighting that implementation quality, local context, and appropriate targeting determine success. These evaluations relied on satellite-based methods because traditional approaches face constraints from conflict, geographic scale, or measurement challenges. Notably, these evaluations were conducted at approximately 1/3 of the cost of conventional impact evaluations. That being said, more research is needed on whether irrigation infrastructure and water management improvements translate to household welfare gains, like income and food security, and on the long-term sustainability of integrated aquaculture systems after program support ends. So, in closing, I'd like to focus our attention on an agenda for effective climate action that attends to the patchy evidence base on climate interventions. Climate change threatens livelihoods and well-being globally, but its impacts fall disproportionately on those least responsible for the crisis. More than 3 billion people live in contexts highly vulnerable to climate change. And let me highlight that since the 1970s, 90% of climate-related deaths and 60% of economic losses have occurred in low and middle-income country settings. With that in mind, we would like to underscore President Lula's opening message about why we're all here, that we should aspire to make this a COP of implementation, adaptation, and economic integration of climate policy, and above all, the COP that listens to and believes in science. What we found across thousands of studies spanning 3IE's climate research is that there are critical gaps in the availability of rigorous evidence on the effects of climate change interventions in low and middle income countries. As Birte highlighted at the start, in some ways, we're flying blind. This evidence is needed now to reduce losses, especially for the world's most vulnerable. Climate finance amounted to approximately $4.8 trillion between 2011 and 2020. Committing merely 0.1% of that investment in rigorous evidence generation would be transformational for the globe. To be explicit, this comes out to be approximately 4.8 billion US dollars for evidence generation, which indeed is a tiny fraction of total climate finance. We need research on both promising interventions, such as bundled agricultural insurance, climate smart technologies, and women's empowerment, as well as on critical gaps, such as household welfare impacts, long-term sustainability, and climate interventions in humanitarian settings. Climate adaptation and mitigation are just some of the pieces of the overall strategy. Global commitment and financing of emissions reduction strategies guided by evidence on what works are badly needed. So let me leave you with this thought. One way to think about the $4.8 billion, or equivalent of 0.1% investment in climate evidence, is that it can serve as a relatively modest insurance policy on climate finance and maximize the impact and ensure that trillions in climate finance go where they work best. Thanks so much for your time. We'll move into the next section here for a question and answer period. So I'll hand it back to you, Birte.
Thank you. So we have a few questions, but I would also encourage attendees, if you have any additional questions, please pop those in the chat. So one question is, given the scale of evidence gap, how should funders prioritize which climate interventions to evaluate first? And then there is another question, which is, how can we better measure household impacts from climate agriculture interventions and not just environmental outcomes? So perhaps, Esteban, do you want to start with tackling those?
I can venture some responses for those, but I certainly welcome your inputs as well, Birte. So I think I'll go in reverse order. So the question about measuring household welfare impacts, I think is front of mind in the work that I do, and certainly. Some of what 3IE has shown recently is that there are, different measurement approaches that we can take. Some of that was highlighted in using the geospatial approaches for understanding what happens with agriculture or water use. And so satellite imagery, I think, is important for that. But that certainly limits, let's say, the way we think or can measure welfare and livelihoods. And so I think we need to go much further, whether it's phone-based, high-frequency surveys that can be done in a sort of leaner way, or in other cases where we might be more interested in nutrition outcomes and health, then we might want to be thinking carefully about using biomarkers. I think those are critical directions that we need to go in. I also always want to do a full consumption survey, but understand the need for balance, and do believe that subjective well-being measures can be an important way to look at the sort of ultimate welfare impacts. So let me stop there, and I'll see if you have some thoughts to add, Birte, before going to the other question.
No, I think, did you want to address the first question, or?
Sure, I can add a little bit there. So I think that there are a number of places we highlighted earlier, and so I think that when it comes to specific outcomes, household welfare impacts links directly into what we were just talking about. But I think long-term sustainability, which requires longer scopes, timeframes for studies, as well as a better understanding of cost effectiveness are areas that I think are highly merited for focus. But beyond that, I do think that broader areas that we need to know much more about are, let's say, integrated aquaculture and agriculture systems, as well as off-grid electrification. In that case, even though we had more than 600 studies, if I remember correctly, they were clustered very much so in few countries. And then the last thing I'll add is that I do think, which is related to that point, that there are some contexts that have many studies and many areas that have very few, whether it's parts of Latin America or sub-Saharan Africa, and especially those that not only suffer from climate shocks or are vulnerable to climate issues, but that are also affected by either conflict or humanitarian issues. And those are particularly weak spots, let's say, in the evidence base that should be, I think, prioritized.
Well, I think those are all great points, and I do think that to some extent the evidence bases that exist reflect a little bit the fragmentation that Victor is getting at in the comments, and I think also that perhaps it's rather than there being a deliberate strategic research agendas, that it's perhaps a bit opportunistic and doesn't necessarily reflect a prioritization of the highest investment areas or the contexts with the greatest potential for emission reductions, for example. So I think those are key considerations that should also help drive prioritization. Is where do we theoretically think that there is there the most potential impact for research to add value, either because we know that there is significant investment or significant potential for emissions reductions, or a significant need to scale up adaptation action. So
I'd like to add something there, Birte, if I could just briefly, because
sure.
I do think that yeah, I do think that fragmentation is a substantive issue that we didn't, let's say, highlight in the same way as gaps, but we need to, as a let's say, as a global group, we need to, I think, lower the barriers to conducting rigorous and impactful research, so that we don't, and all of us do this, we don't have to always just turn to what might be the sort of more opportunistic or low-hanging fruit when something else might actually be more important and hold the potential for more impact. And to that end, I do think these are great opportunities, because agreeing on common outcome frameworks, measurements, protocols, and ways of coordinating research sort of foci are critical to going in the right direction to lowering those barriers and being more coordinated, so that we don't exhibit quite as much fragmentation.
And so very briefly, in 30 seconds, because I think we will actually be cut off at the 30-minute mark. But can you say a few words about ensuring that evidence is flowing into decision making at all levels? So we've talked about kind of the need for evidence generation, but how do we make sure that the evidence is communicated and used?
Sure, I think everyone involved in generating or using evidence needs to make an effort, in a sense, to often step out of their comfort zone and engage with evidence producers or evidence users in intuitive ways that are accessible to ensure that evidence is being used at all levels.
Excellent. And I think that's a good point to end this. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to connect to continue the conversation.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye bye.